Happy Saturday, scientists. Let's review. We have scaled up. We started with cells, we've seen organisms, and now we're looking at whole communities and ecosystems. This week, it's community-level systems, or topic B4, as we begin the paper 2 topics in biology, chemistry, and physics. Ecosystems are made up of all living organisms and physical conditions in an area. The community is made up of the living organisms, and the habitat is the area in which they live. These are some of the many keywords that we will need to know for this topic, so now's a good time to break out your index cards and prepare yourself a set of keyword revision cards. In addition to the 3 that we've already defined, there are a few more that you will also need to know about the different roles that organisms can have in their communities. First of all, a population is all the members of a species living in an area. A producer is an organism that is able to make its own food. In most cases, these are plants. A consumer is an organism that needs to eat others for food. This may be a consumer that eats plants, or it may be a consumer that eats other consumers. A decomposer is an organism that feeds on dead or decaying organic matter. And a detritivore is an organism that breaks down dead organic matter into smaller chunks. It's important to understand the different roles that the organisms will have in an ecosystem, and that all of these rules are connected in order for the ecosystem to function properly. For example, if there weren't decomposers to release their enzymes and nutrients and break down the material that surrounds them, then we wouldn't have the ability to return those nutrients to the rest of the ecosystem to be available. They would become trapped. And so all of these organisms are going to have different relationships with the ecosystem around them, and those relationships are going to be defined into 2 categories. The abiotic relationships, or abiotic factors, and these are non-living factors. So you can think of some examples such as sunlight or water. These will affect how organisms live and how they're distributed around the community, but these are not able, they're not alive, they're not sort of able to change based on their own sort of whims or thinking. Whereas biotic factors are living factors, so essentially they are other organisms. These biotic factors will lead to competition between organisms for different resources. And there are some things that all organisms compete for, but there are some things that are specific to plants or to animals. If you think about a plant, it's going to need light in order to survive. So it may compete with other plants, trying to shade them out so that it can win, or trying to grow faster so that it gets to the sunlight first and casts its shadow on other things. It will compete for water, so their root systems will compete with each other in order to get access to water. It might compete for carbon dioxide in certain environments. It will also compete for minerals in the soil, and finally for space to grow. Animals will compete for some similar things. They'll compete for food instead of minerals, They will also compete for space in order to live. Sometimes you might see this labeled as territory. Animals will compete for water as well. They'll compete for breeding partners. And they may also compete for shelter. These competitions will lead to different interactions between the various organisms in the ecosystem, and we'll categorize those relationships based on their interactions. So a predation interaction is where one organism eats another. And the organism that does the eating is the predator, and the one that is eaten is the prey. And you may see these classic relationship graphs with the number of individuals and time, and then you might have, for example, this sort of cycle with predators. And then what will happen with the prey is that they will start at a higher population, and as the predators eat them, the prey population will drop. But then once the predators have eaten all the prey, their population begins to drop because they don't have food, and so the prey population will increase again, and you'll have this cyclical relationship between predators and prey. And this is a classic example of this relationship, and you might need to analyze that graph and to explain why it's happening in those cycles. So why does the population of predators go up when the population of prey is high, for example? And the answer is because there's food available for those predators, and so they can support growing of more organisms, and they can support themselves. Another relationship that you might come across is mutualism, and this is a relationship in which both organisms benefit. So you can think of those small fish that swim along and eat bacteria out of larger fish's scales or off their skin, for example. That would be a mutual relationship. The one fish has the parasites eaten off of it, and the other fish has food, and so is not able to, or doesn't have to, go out looking for food. It's kind of right there for it. However, there are some relationships where it's not quite such a benefit to both organisms, and these are parasites. So this is when one organism harms another. And you can think of examples such as parasitic worms or other cases where you have something that's sort of eating something or harming something, stealing nutrients from its blood, for example. Our next topic is nutrient cycles, and this is the ways or the pathways in which the different things that we need travel around the ecosystem. So often you will find them in the form of an inorganic molecule or ion. And from there it will be absorbed by plants. And so it will enter the store of a plant. The plant might be eaten by an animal. The plant or animal may die, and so decomposers will then take up that molecule and somehow return it back to the original store or to the original cycle. Some of the nutrient cycles are more complex than others, but this is the general flow that you have. Something is absorbed by the plants, makes its way up the food chain, and at all levels, as things die, it returns to the decomposers, which return it back up to its original store. While water isn't a nutrient, it does cycle through the environment or different ecosystems, and we do need to understand how this happens. And so if you'll permit some very bad artwork, we're going to begin with a body of water such as an ocean, for example. And as this would heat up, some of the molecules are going to have enough energy to evaporate. If you need more details on how much energy that is, think back to physics and to specific latent heat, or the energy needed to change state. So they will then be in the form of water vapor. The water vapor will condense in order to form clouds. Those clouds will then eventually cool to the point where some form of precipitation, either rain or snow or hail, will fall out of the clouds onto the landscape, and then it may travel underground through a phenomenon known as percolation. It may travel overground as surface runoff, or it may be absorbed by various different plants that are on the surface. So it may go up into the plants through a process of transpiration and absorption, and then it would leave the leaves through transpiration. If you want to take a look at the transpiration experiments, those are back at the start of biology, and I do recommend that you familiarize yourself with that experiment. So this transpiration would lead it to be in the form of water vapor, at which point the cycle can repeat itself. The next cycle we need to look at is the carbon cycle. And for the carbon cycle, it's important to understand the different steps to that cycle, as well as to understand the human effects that have been had on this cycle. Because none of us want to see my attempt at drawing the artwork involved in the carbon cycle, we're going to represent the different stores with boxes. We'll begin with the atmosphere. And you need to understand that the form carbon takes in each of these places is sometimes different. So it's carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. The next store that you're going to find is, of course, plants. You will also find carbon stored in animals. You will find it stored in the soil. And you will find it stored in fossil fuels. In all of these stores, carbon is going to be in the form of organic compounds. So things such as glucose, for example, made by the plant. In order for carbon dioxide to pass from the atmosphere into the plant, the process that needs to take place is photosynthesis. For carbon dioxide to pass from the plants into the animals, the process that needs to take place is feeding. And we know that the animals will engage in respiration in order to return that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. As plants and animals die, you are going to have a passage into the soil, and it will be helped along by decomposition. From there, over millions of years, it may become fossil fuels, at which point we as humans will tend to extract it, and then it will be used in various different industries or in our homes, and it will go back up in the form of CO2, and the process that makes that happen is combustion. This cycle can remain in balance if we're careful about all the processes that are happening, However, as humans, we have knocked the balance of this substantially as we have done more and more extraction and more combustion. And so the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have been seen to rise over the number of years. So the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up over time. However, if you zoom in on this concentration of CO2, you see that within each year, you are going to have the carbon dioxide level increase and decrease as different processes take place. So the rest of the cycle is still continuing to keep up. In the spring and summer, when there's lots of plant cover, then photosynthesis will bring the levels back down. In the winter, when there's less plant cover, and so there is also more combustion from humans, but animal respiration happening as well, you get an increase in the levels of CO2. Don't forget as well that there is another respiration process that is happening that is important, and that is the respiration of the decomposers. The last and final cycle that we need to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is essential for the formation of proteins because nitrogen is part of the amino acid. Once again, it's useful to picture the nitrogen cycle in terms of its various different stores. So we will begin with the atmosphere. With the nitrogen cycle, it is especially critical to understand the various different forms that nitrogen will take, because some of these forms are usable by plants and animals, and some of these forms are not. And so we need to understand which form it's in which place. So in the atmosphere, nitrogen is found in N2, or in a nitrogen gas. Next, of course, we have plants, we have animals, and we have the soil. And nitrogen will take on different forms in these different places. To get nitrogen from the atmosphere into plants, we need to change the form of that nitrogen. And to do this, we need to use nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria, what these guys are going to do is they're going to take the N2 and they're going to turn it into nitrates, or NO3-, so forms of this ion. From there, the plants are able to absorb the nitrates and use them in their growth and construction of proteins, and then by feeding, the animals are able to take on those nitrates. From this point, as these organisms die off, nitrogen will enter the soil via decomposers. It will also enter the soil via waste from animals, such as in urine, and the form that it will enter into the soil is in the form of ammonium, or NH4. In that soil, you may have bacteria that will take the ammonium and they will come back to make these nitrates again. And these are called nitrifying bacteria. And they will change the NH4 into NO3, at which point it can enter the plants again. There are a few different ways that the cycle will continue or will repeat itself and move these forms around. From the nitrates, we will find it returning to the atmosphere through the function of denitrifying bacteria. And from the atmosphere, we may find it traveling down in the form of nitrates thanks to the action of lightning. So all of these processes combine to move nitrogen around the various different parts of the cycle and make it available or unavailable to the various different organisms that may need it. It's been a relatively short video this week, but this topic does come with plenty of keywords. Make sure you take the time to study them and that you know what word to use in what situation. This will really take your answers up to the next level and help you to score those higher level marks or those second and third marks on the written answer questions. There's a revision worksheet attached in the video description, and the answers to that will be released next week. As always, if you have any questions, please leave those in the comments below. And until next time, happy sciencing.